Welcome to the Legion Strength and Conditioning Podcast. You can check us out at legionsc.com or follow us on Instagram at legion.sc. So today we're going to talk about the difference between sustainable work and unsustainable work in training, meaning if you're thinking about your pace on different conditioning pieces, are you doing something where you're able to consistently repeat your paces, or are you doing something that, if you were asked to do one more interval or 30 more seconds of work, that you would be not only unhappy, but incapable of performing the requested task. So within writing training programs, there's a balance to be found between how much sustainable work you do, meaning how much work is at a pace that you can repeat over and over again, that may be challenging, but isn't something that's sort of making you fall apart as you go through it, versus unsustainable work, which is very hard, high intensity, etc., that is often more used in like a pre-competition phase. So as coaches, we're often thinking about what is the appropriate balance to be found between prescribing sustainable versus unsustainable work. And we also want to think about what benefits do each of these have and what type of athlete needs to be doing certain amounts of sustainable work or, unsustainable work, depending on what their characteristics are and what they actually need to improve. So, Luke, we were just talking before we started recording about what might be some examples of sustainable work versus unsustainable work and how one might approach pacing those as an athlete sort of executing on the session. Can you give us a rundown of what you were just saying?
Yeah, so I mean, with the work that we're doing, we sort of have to characterize it as either being like cyclical, monostructural based work, or potentially mixed work as well. The two examples that I gave earlier would be, Todd, you wrote this in my program a couple of months ago, was 5 rounds, 30 seconds assault bike at 100%, and then 2 minutes and 30-second rest. And I remember you just writing the notes there, just sort of like looking to see attrition here. So I knew straight away that was something that was testing my max capabilities, and just more of an observation than a training piece for you, so that you can sort of see what the drop off is there. You can just sort of see what my max capacity is able to consistently put out, with around about a 5 to 1 rest to work ratio there. The other end of that spectrum is going to be something where it's sort of like sit on a stationary bike for 20 minutes, listen to a podcast or an audiobook, don't even think about the pace, just move. And the goal there is not necessarily to be holding any sort of pace or anything like that, but it's just to be have consistent movement, for more sort of recovery purposes. So there's 2 examples there. If we are looking at, for instance, training and accumulating consistent output and sustainable work, this is something that's going to be very common, is people going through things like 500-meter row repeats, 30-second intervals, 30 seconds off, that type of stuff, and sort of week to week looking to do a little bit more work. And then if we're looking at a mixed setting, we have to take into variables things such as skill. For someone, sustainable work in a mixed setting might be doing things like walking lunges and no push-up burpees and, rowing at a certain pace. Whereas for other people, those people who are more advanced within the sport and are able to operate with a higher rate of dynamic contractions and things, it could be doing things like dumbbell devil presses and handstand walks and muscle ups, that's like that type of stuff. So yeah, within sustainable work, I think you have to understand, first of all, if it's a training, something that you're doing for training, something you're doing for more sort of performance, and then especially with cyclical stuff, it's a lot easier to bracket things as sustainable or unsustainable. But where with mixed work, what we could probably characterize as sustainable is, doing repeated AMRAPs of similar based movements for sort of similar volume, about 45 seconds of work on each movement, and just practicing that sort of high turnover environment. And then something unsustainable is going to be something where you are working at a pace which is going to be very, very difficult for you to hold on to, and that could be something as simple as like a 21:59 style couplet or triplet. So yeah, that's sort of my thoughts on sustainability. I think that most often or not, you you get people at opposite ends of the spectrum. So you get people who just don't know how to hold sustainable paces, and that's quite a big issue. And then as well as that, you get people who, for instance, have just developed a comfort in training and they are holding sustainable paces and just learn to sort of lose that ability to push, or just potentially are afraid of it as well, after they sort of, see that there's some success from developing this idea of pacing and sustainable work.
Yeah, and I think to dig in and get a little in the weeds with some of the examples that you used, we can sort of clarify what we mean by sustainable versus unsustainable, right? So we can think about, if we're just using, to make it simple, intervals on an assault bike, right? That we're thinking about not just what is the repeatability across intervals, but what is the actual pace within that interval, right? So if we say something like, that 30 seconds very hard with 2.5 minutes rest that you were talking about, that your pace on that might be sustainable within the 30 seconds, meaning that you are able to hold, I don't know, let's say 85 RPM or something like that for the entire 30 seconds. And that would be sustainable within that interval. And then you're able to hold 85 RPM for all 5 of those intervals, meaning it was sustainable not only within the interval, but across those intervals. But then we also have the concept of, well, what if that was 40 seconds? Would you have been able to hold that same pace? And the answer may have been no, right? So it was sustainable within the 30 seconds, but not sustainable much past that. And then we also have the concept of, okay, you did 5 intervals. If you did 6 or 7 or 8, would you have been able to maintain that same pace there? So it's not always just what were you able to do within that exact session, but what would you have been able to do if you were asked to do more as well, which, it can get a little bit gray and confusing when we're talking about sustainable versus unsustainable work or pacing appropriately, because you may actually be doing something unsustainable in terms of your ability to do more work at that pace or more intervals, but you were able to, in your training log, write that you got the same thing for each specific interval. So I think that can maybe be a little confusing, but can also clarify what we're actually shooting for with the training for those types of pieces.
I think a point there would be understanding the effect of what someone's doing within a session. So you're saying there, if we throw an extra 3 intervals on there, is someone still able to hit the same pace and keep it sustainable? I think at that point it's looking at the session and being like, okay, well, I know I have this extra intervals. How do I need to adjust my pace? Say last week we did 5 rounds of 30 on, 230 rest, and I was able to hold this pace. Now we're doing 7 rounds this week. What do I need to do to my pace? Like, how do I need to adjust it to keep it sustainable from where it was last week?
Yeah, and I think that's a huge part of the sport, and it's that is skill development, really, and sort of in the wider scheme of things, if you're looking at the idea of pacing and understanding what you're able to hold, what your capacity is, especially in things like pre-competition phases, you have to be really conscious of that type of stuff. I think what people they just tend to sort of, and we've discussed this before, but they just tend to bracket their training. They're like, I am doing skill work, I am doing strength work, I am doing this, and it's just like it is all under that umbrella of skill acquisition. Like, what we're trying to do is get people to just be more self-aware whilst they're training, so that they can then just use those experiences constantly to refine the process. And it gets to a point, when you're a couple of years in, when it's just like, you might get one thing that you learned from your week of training, but like that's probably what and that happens, and that happens in all aspects of life and development and things like that. So it's just about really, like as you said, John, it's like giving yourself those opportunities to assess what you've done, write in your training session, in your results and things like that. Communicate with your coach. They might adjust the program design for you somewhat, or they might give you the same thing next week. You hear of Boris Shaker, the powerlifting coach. Like he's a big advocate of just repeating the same program over and over again until it stops working, because he knows that if you have an athlete who is going to be very on top of it in terms of their work and assessing what they do, then they're gonna make sure that they maintain that progression and they assess what they're doing. I mean, off tangent a little bit, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that another thing to consider with that, Luke, because I mean, you're talking about learning, which is actually a huge part of why we want to be very deliberate with what kinds of paces we're going at, right? Is you want to learn about yourself as an athlete, what you can and can't do, what is and isn't sustainable, how you feel at different paces with different combinations of movements. But then we're also trying to think about what are we training relative to our capacity when we do need to execute in something that matters, right? Where we are trying to get our best score possible or qualify for something or beat someone else. And that if we're thinking about that, we want to think about almost like two different types of training, right? One is what pace can we go at that is sustainable? And the person who can do more work more sustainably is probably going to perform better on the types of tests that we typically see in 10-minute AMRAPs and certain numbers of muscle ups, after doing a bunch of other stuff. So if you don't have to dig as deep to do as much work, you will probably do better. But then on the flip side of that, when it is time to compete, you do have to be able to just sort of cut loose and go, right? So you're thinking about developing almost two sides of the coin at the same time of, can you do more work more sustainably so you don't have to try as hard so that you can do it for longer and get more reps done? And then do you have that extra gear or two that you can go to when your score actually counts, such that when you do need to push, that you are able to do so? And that's why we have to find the appropriate balance between the two.
I think there's also a point there on how to read workouts in a competition setting. So in training, it's one thing to know kind of what you're capable of and what you want, how you want to approach the pacing of something. But I think in competition, it's important to be able on the fly to adapt to something and realize, okay, let's say, pick a workout. Okay, say we're doing
chaos from the games.
What was that?
It's the one where they didn't know the reps.
And they just they didn't even know the movements. So you had Brent Fikowski doing this burpee to target and not even jumping. And then you had Josh Bridges doing a vertical jump.
Okay, so that's a good kind of example. To know how the different movements affect each other, to know what kind of, well, that's maybe too extreme because you really can't pick a different workout. But something, let's say, that comes out and it's 5 rounds and each round starts with a 30 cal assault bike and then there's some kind of barbell work alongside it. Knowing that you can hold, let's say for a guy, a 75 RPM on the bike for 2 minutes and it's not going to crush you. What are you talking about, Luke? I forgot you do have little legs, I suppose. But knowing that, and then knowing that, okay, if I'm going to be throwing in a bunch of deadlifts alongside this, realistically, that pace is going to have to drop, 5 RPM to be able to sustain that for 5 rounds. And being able to know that kind of without testing it, without having specifically done that same workout before, and having trained it in enough different scenarios that you have an understanding of, okay, I know I can hold this bike pace regardless of what else I'm doing.
You got go on.
No, you carry on.
I was going to say, I think that athletes have got to understand those sort of baseline things where they know that if they're in deep shit, that they can dig themselves out at holding a certain pace, or they can, and we've mentioned this before, they can create control on this movement, and then they can try to pick it up, and part of that as well is about being able to recover mid-workout, which is, another capacity within itself. But I think that the whole, with sort of competition style work, I mean, for instance, Todd, you gave me doing the assault bike intervals to sort of develop that fatigue and then to go into an AMRAP. So I found that very, very useful, but by the sort of third session of doing that, I was like, all right, okay, I'm really getting the idea of this and I can sort of understand what's going on here. But do you want to just run over that and then just sort of talk about the aims there?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the sessions that you're talking about the ones that were 5 minutes on the assault bike into another 5-minute AMRAP. Is that the structure? I
mean, no. More the assault bike sprints. Every 2 minutes, clear it out on the road, then go into a competition style workout.
Yeah, definitely got it. So, the idea there was some kind of nasty cyclical sprints, sort of like we were talking about earlier. I don't remember the exact intervals, but they were relatively short, so probably somewhere in like the 30 seconds range, with a few minutes of easy spin in between. So something that was purposefully unsustainable to essentially create like a pre-fatigue scenario, right, where you go hard and build up a bunch of fatigue in terms of, metabolic waste sort of having to be shuttled around your system and just like general discomfort. And then from there, go into a more, mixed modal testing type of scenario, already pre-fatigued, right? So the goal there, this is not sustainable training. This is stuff that's kind of nasty and is meant to essentially prepare you for a more competitive scenario where you are going to have to execute when you feel terrible, right? That you are going to have to say, I'm looking at the clock and I'm 12 minutes into a 20-minute workout and I'm not where I thought I was going to be. What do I do for the next 8 minutes? And if you have only trained, sustainable, repeatable, well-paced efforts, that you're not going to feel very good in that scenario. Well, not that anyone is going to feel good in that scenario, but you're not going to have the capacity to, know what that feels like and understand how you do need to pace yourself and what type of transitions you can maintain and what exercises you can recover on as you're attempting to keep moving. So with something like that, we're thinking almost like pre-fatigue muscle endurance sets in a bodybuilding scenario where it's like, all right, do a bunch of bicep curls, then do weighted pull-ups and see what happens. And this is a somewhat similar idea of do some pretty nasty short cyclical sprints to pre-fatigue you on a global level before then moving into more standard mixed work, which should be hopefully a pretty valuable learning situation, as well as, I hate the concepts of mental toughness, but more just like teaching you that it's okay to be uncomfortable, but that you can still move and execute based upon like your previous fitness that you've developed.
Yeah, like I think that was, first couple of sessions it took a bit of learning to get through that, but I think one of the most valuable things there was it's understanding sort of what your capacity is like under the curve, right? It's like, what are you able to do worst case scenario? Because I think that is often like what people measure their fitness off of and what people measure their sort of ability is like, okay, I can do my 30-30 on rowing for 30 minutes and like I can take 2-minute breaks every 10 minutes. Like I know I can do that, but it's like, okay, cool. But what is like your rowing ability when you have all of this other shit going on and you are a couple of days deep into a competition, or you have a super high stress environment where you're not just training on a Thursday morning anymore. You're now, you have a load of people watching you and you have someone next to you who's going really fast and then you're going to try and chase them. And then it's just, I think that, as we sort of spoken about, it's like trying to understand sort of the learning you can get from your training. And then also understanding that the sport isn't meant to test you when you're fresh. Like it's not a measurement of like, what can you do in the best case scenario? Or, what can you do on your Instagram highlight reel? Or what can you do on it? It's like, no, what can you do when all of that stuff is out the window? And, it's like I just did the French throwdown qualifier where it's like max snatch, 150 burpees, max, like 3-rep max snatch. And it's like that, like that 3-rep max snatch is probably going to reduce depending on the individual, but, a substantial amount after doing 150 burpees and pushing yourself off the floor. Your upper body's a bit jacked up from that and your legs are tired and you got that sort of like global fatigue. But I think that understanding unsustainable work and how to operate within it and how to be okay and not like stressed out to fuck is going to be like really important if you want to be successful in the sport. But then also understanding that like you need to do a shit ton of sustainable stuff to be able to learn and to be able to almost like create I don't know how to describe it, but like I've heard some people sort of like almost say like you hear some people saying like you need to be able to do sustainable work to earn the right to do unsustainable type stuff. Like you need to be able to learn how to do that, which I sort of agree with, right? It's like it's almost saying you need to do 5 sets of 10 before you start doing like a 10-rep max or a 5-rep max. So I think that it's sort of understanding that pyramid structure of like base building, etc., etc.
think something you touched on there, Luke, with regards to competition, the having the training backup to be able to either trust yourself and stick to your game plan in a competition, or to know that you have the ability to, say, chase someone down who is going a little faster than you'd ideally like to go, but you think you can sustain your pace even if you try and keep up with them. And I think that's where kind of the hours in the gym, working on these kind of sustainable pieces, can really pay off when it comes to competition. Trusting yourself to chase someone outside your comfort zone or outside your plan, or trusting yourself to stick to your game plan and know that you're going to come good by the end of the workout. And even if that means you don't beat someone, knowing that you ended up with your best score or best time or whatever it is.
Yeah, I think that the sustainable type stuff, people do actually get like mixed up. That like they think that sustainable work is all sort of that zone one type, just moving, where like the intensity isn't going to be too high. But if you're taking like your aerobic training to sort of like a good high level, you're going to be suffering through sustainable work. It's not going to be as easy, and for some people it's actually harder. And I think for some people who just like don't necessarily, I mean, you could just say they're a little bit just more sensitive to it, and sometimes I know I found it difficult to learn how to do that type of stuff, and I still find it more difficult, and I'm a little bit more you could say sort of attuned to like just jumping from one thing to the other, and like being this sort of having this like ADHD type style like attention span on each movement, and being able to like suffer for 10 seconds and then jump into something until it feels like it's going to burn, and then I'm going to change it up for something else. Whereas like if you're sat on a rowing machine, or you're sat on your salt bike, or if you're going through like the same sort of like dumbbells and actual marble intervals constantly, and it's just like chipping away at you, sometimes that is really hard. And I think that is the confidence that you develop, like you said, John. It's like when you do that type of stuff, that's when and you're trying to chase someone down, like, or you're trying to sort of keep a lead. I think that's an even bigger one. It's like when you've got like a lead on a workout and you're trying to sort of maintain that when people are chasing you, but you've got to keep that high pace constantly going. Yeah.
And I think that another aspect that's relevant here is that the ways that fatigue accumulates are very complicated and misunderstood, particularly in a mixed modal environment, right? So that we don't have a great understanding of what actually causes people to have to stop or slow down. That it's some messy interplay between, peripheral signals from the muscles, meaning that there's been too much accumulation of metabolic waste or too many eccentric contractions, so the muscle is damaged. Too much, not enough oxygen actually entering the cells to be able to continue metabolic processes, combined with the sort of top-down, brain-dominated aspects of fatigue, meaning how does this feel relative to your expectations? Where do you sit relative to people who you want to compete against? Are the paces in alignment with what you think that you can do? Or are you seeing numbers show up on your splits that make you think, I'm going too fast, or I'm going faster than I thought that I was and I feel good. So that then gives you a little bit of a kick. What's your core body temperature? Like all these things combine in some sort of messy way to actually cause fatigue. And when we're thinking about sustainability versus unsustainability, it's difficult to know which of these factors is potentially actually limiting us from doing work more sustainably, or which ones we're sort of able to keep in check and do work that is difficult as an athlete, whether in a competition or a training setting, but do so sustainably. So, it's hard to say what exactly we're training, but it is relevant to understand that we have so many different factors that actually can be implicated in terms of creating fatigue. And that in these varied training scenarios, we're probably training all of them on and off without necessarily knowing exactly what we're working on. So that through prescriptions and pacing, ideally in these chaotic environments, we are able to just in aggregate learn how to handle all of these different fatigue scenarios and potentially, deal with them appropriately when they do come up, when we are actually trying to do well at something.
Well, for me personally, like 8 years into doing this, and it's still a challenge. And I think it's more of a challenge understanding pacing and things like that than it is understanding like ability and technique within more technical things like weightlifting and gymnastics and that type of stuff. Is sort of I think I watched a video once, and Graham Holmberg, it was like day in the life number 1 and 2. And Graham Holmberg was basically saying like, I just do so many couplets and triplets because then I could just know the sort of what the combination of movements and what they feel like, and what I can hold on them and things like that. And I think that was probably like my first like sort of idea of exposing, in this sport you have to expose yourself to as many different things as possible. But even then, like you can have done this pairing of movements a million times before, but because you don't know exactly that scenario, that time domain, that amount of reps, that amount of fatigue that's been created from whatever you did before, it's something that is just constantly a refining process. And I think that is probably one of the biggest challenges for a fitness athlete, is that they want to be able to say, I've mastered this and I'm good at this, but it's just, at the end of the day, it's actually something that is going to be fairly impossible to grasp in your time, like completely. And the best in the world, we watch them do it, they have that sort of intuition with the body where they understand where to hold off and push. Todd, I know you've said you spoke with James Fitzgerald about them just potentially having just different physiology and just being able to cope with different things a lot better than everyone else. And then as well as that, they have a ridiculous amount of training volume. So, everything you've done, they've probably done 3 times. And then it's, there's lots of factors at play, and understanding what to, like everyone can probably finish every workout a little bit better if they pace it somewhat better. And if you actually listen to elite athletes after events at regionals and sanctionals and stuff like that, that's what they talk about. They talk about, I went out too hot on this and I went out too hot, not on like, I should have used a false grip on my muscle ups, or there's like, there's like sort of those, they don't talk about those technical things.
Yeah, I think that your point on the constant variation is pretty relevant, and to use a kind of a slightly incorrect analogy, but one that will suffice. Essentially you're learning to play jazz, not classical, right? That you're not learning to execute a script flawlessly. It's not like, okay, here's this ridiculous run that I have to be able to play in this, Tchaikovsky piece, and I'm just going to sit here and practice this exact same thing over and over and over again. You have to learn, all right, well, these are the general chord shapes and these are the scales that can go over them, and these are the types of chords that I can substitute for these chords, and I know that the bass player tends to do this, so I'm going to do this instead. And you're learning all these little heuristics, but on a daily basis, the actual scenario that you're in is going to be pretty different based upon what you've done previously and what the actual combinations of movements are. So it's much more about that adaptability and ability to kind of adjust on the fly, which is hopefully learned through the training of these different sustainable and unsustainable scenarios.
I think there's also, people need to be careful of chasing that, in the sense of trying to do too many combinations and things in the pursuit of knowing how everything's going to feel. I think it can be, I don't want to say a waste of time, but I think it can be focusing on the wrong things if they're constantly chasing that. Oh, I've got to try these things together. I've got to try this rep scheme so I know what it feels like.
But I think that comes down to the amount of variation of movements there are, and people bracket things. They don't understand the relationship between it. So it's like, if they blow up every single time they're doing like hip extension and another movement, then that's the issue, and that's what needs to be trained, and then it needs to be sort of broken down in terms of skill and then built up again, as opposed to it being like, I don't know why my heavy dumbbell snatches and my deadlifts like always don't work with this movement. It's like, it's sort of understanding the interplay and relationships between movements. Obviously there's lots of, you can sort of look at movement patterns, but then there's always these different nuances within them. But I think that's an important part, and that's where sort of obviously having the coaches is useful, because quite often you look at your training log and you try to look at it from like this very, very sort of like simplistic point of view, but then you don't really have that sort of overview and that bird's eye view of things as well. But like, yeah, I think that, yeah, sort of chasing those You know, like almost people watching too many like YouTube motivational videos, and they're like, "Yeah, I need to fail all these times to then then be successful." And it's like, no, don't cut yourself every day. That's not going to work. And being anti-fragile doesn't work like that.
Thanks for listening. While you're here, go ahead and head over to your podcast player, subscribe to the show, give it a rating, give it a review, all that good stuff. You can also go ahead and click through to the show notes where you can find out more about us at legionsc.com, and also follow us on Instagram at legion.sc.